Hi everyone, welcome back to lesson 49 of Teddy Poet Actual Speaking. I am of course Jennifer Clyde and it's great to have you joining me. Well, as I did mention, it's time for lesson 49 and today we'll be talking about culture shock. So what is culture shock? It's a type of shock. Okay, so it is a condition of confusion and anxiety, I guess simply put. You can experience culture shock when you go to a new country perhaps. You know, you're overwhelmed with the differences, the feelings of anger, anxiety, confusion. That all has to do with culture shock. But not only when you travel to different countries where they have a different way of life and culture, you can also experience culture shock when you move homes, when you move to a new job, or even when you enter college. So simply put, people experience culture shock in new surroundings, unfamiliar surroundings, and it often takes time to adjust, get used to the new environment. So did you ever experience culture shock? If you have, great, let's talk about it. Let's begin today's lesson on culture shock. Welcome back everyone. Are you ready to get started? Let's start with our warm-up segment, of course, with the 5 W's and how questions. Let's begin. The first W question is, as always, who? Now we are going to brainstorm with these cues. What you have to do is perhaps ask yourselves these questions. Now these questions will help you talk about this topic much more easily and smoothly, okay? So what about this first question? Are you easily affected by unfamiliar cultures, settings, or even environments, okay? Now, if you are sensitive to new settings, new environments, or if you are easily affected by, okay, these settings perhaps, maybe you are a very sensitive person and you have experienced culture shock many, many times, okay? Let's move on to what, okay? What kinds of culture shock have you experienced in life? So think about the different kinds of culture shock that you experienced. Also, what kinds of settings or environments do you find most uncomfortable, okay? The key here is uncomfortable. So settings is perhaps like an atmosphere, an environment. So in what kinds of environments, atmospheres, or settings do you feel most uncomfortable? You can talk about that as well. Now, what were, okay, we're gonna talk about what happened in the past, okay? So let's take you into what happened in the past. What were some common symptoms of culture shock you've experienced? So we'll be taking a look at some expressions and phrases and keywords you can use to explain these common symptoms related to culture shock later on. But in the meantime, think about, your own story and your own experiences. Moving on to our when category. When did you experience the biggest culture shock? Now this is a pretty simple question, right? So when was it that you really experienced the biggest culture shock? Moving on. When do you think people experience culture shock? When they first come to Korea. Okay, so we're talking about foreigners, perhaps foreign visitors who come to Korea. They can be tourists, they can be people that come here for business. But think about what you think. So what do you think people experience culture shock when they first come to Korea? So when is it? When they experience A, B, C, D? So think about those questions as well. Let's move on to where. Okay, where or in which country do you think is a prime destination, okay, for culture shock? Where or which country do you think is a prime destination, meaning location? Now, prime here means what? Prime basically means, I guess, well, depending on the context, it can have different meanings, but prime here means like the peak, the most, the main, okay? So think about that question as well, and moving on to why. Why are you, or why aren't you, sensitive to different settings or environments? Now, as I did mention, you could be a very sensitive person, so you can be sensitive to different settings or environments. If you're not, well, you may not be sensitive. In that case, you probably don't really experience culture shock. Okay, moving on to our last category, how questions. How long does it take you to adapt to new environments? So focus on how long it takes, okay? The duration, how long it takes you to adapt to new environments. Adapt here means simply put to adjust to, get used to new environments. How did you first react to culture shock? Okay, how did you react? And then finally, how do you cope or overcome it or them? Now the it or them here, of course, we're talking about culture shock, okay? You may have experienced it once or several times, so talk about that. Now, how did you cope with it? How did you handle the situation? Or how did you overcome it, get over it? And yes, our final question is, how well do you adjust to new settings? Or even as I mentioned, culture shock, well, it not only is a condition that you're affected by when you go to new settings or new countries, but rather even when you enter college perhaps, or maybe go to a different school, transfer schools, or when you get a new job, you're working in a new environment, or even when you go on brief trips, you can experience culture shock. So how well do you adjust to? How well do you adapt to these new settings? Okay, we're done with our brainstorming cues. Let's now move on and listen to today's actual talk. So Peter, you've been in Korea for a good several years now, right?
Quite a long time.
You're probably adapted to Korean life pretty well.
I think I've learned to, navigate the playing field a bit.
Yeah. Did you ever experience culture shock when you
Oh
first
my
came
God,
in?
yes.
Oh yeah?
Well, when you first get off the plane, there's quite a bit to deal with.
Right.
And Korea's very different from, where I come from. Between the, the busyness of the city and the neon lights everywhere.
That's
and
true.
The way people deal with each other. It was a bit difficult in the beginning. And actually, you experience this huge kind of wave of culture shock about 3 months, as I recall.
That's the point where you kind of realize you're in a different country, a different culture, maybe?
Well, or it kind of gets difficult.
Okay.
And that happens kind of every 3 months. There was a rhythm to it. And a lot of other foreigners had this conversation with.
Yeah, it's like the honeymoon period, right? It's like the first 3 months it's really great because you're in a
new
new country,
and
excited, and then by 3 months you kind of realize...
Like, I'm annoyed.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I see. That's interesting.
But after traveling elsewhere in Southeast Asia, nothing shocking anymore.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Why is that? What did you see there?
Well, when you've seen abject poverty, and people really living in horrible situations,
right.
Yeah,
It
changes the way you think about the world.
Yeah, definitely. It's very overwhelming, and those emotions you feel, you can't really describe into words because they're so new. You know, exactly.
So have you had a bit of culture shock?
I have. I spent a couple months in Senegal, West Africa, and I definitely had a few culture shocks there. Things were different. We were eating with our hands rather than utensils, and that's just their culture. So that was different. But I experienced a lot of culture shock when I went back to the States. Reverse culture shock, exactly. But I'll tell you that some other time.
Okay.
As always, thanks to Peter and Rachel for a wonderful conversation about culture shock. So how much of what they exchanged with each other did you understand? Now, Peter mentioned that, he's pretty well adapted to life in Korea. He's lived here for a long time, and it sure sounds like he's traveled a lot to many different countries. So, while he doesn't really experience culture shock. But what about Rachel? I guess she is a bit more sensitive compared to Peter, but she did mention a time that she went to West Africa, Senegal, and she experienced culture shock there. And also when she returned back to the US, back to America, she also experienced culture shock, but it was a different kind of culture shock. It was reverse culture shock. Let's take a look at what they said. So Rachel began by saying, Peter, you've been in Korea for a good several years now. Now, several years, you understand, but you may wonder, why is good there? Does it mean that it is good time and not a bad time? A good several years, okay? A good several years basically means long 7 years, okay? A good 7 years, in this case, does not mean very good, but we're saying for a long several years, for many, many years, in other words. Okay, and of course, Peter agrees. He says, yeah, quite a long time, quite a long time. So you're probably adapted to something, okay? That's right. He's lived in Korea for quite a long time, so he is adapted to Korean life, or life in Korea. And he says, I think I've learned to navigate the playing field a bit. So what does navigate mean? Of course, we do have navigation systems. Many of you that drive do have navigation systems in your car. And what do? They help you to get to where you're trying to get to, right? So basically, navigate means to perhaps move over something, or move through something, move across something. Basically means to move around, okay? And playing field basically is a way of talking about activities or things that you may experience in life. So he's saying, I think I've learned to navigate the playing field a bit. So perhaps he's talking about the challenges he had to face. So he has faced many, many challenges in life. Now she asks, did you ever experience culture shock when you first came here? When you first arrived in Korea? Now, keep in mind, when you use the expression culture shock, we often say experience culture shock or have culture shock. Those are probably the most common ways of saying it. So, did you ever experience culture shock when you first came to Korea, when you first came here? And he says, oh my God, yes. Now, if you listen very carefully to his intonation, how did he say this? Did he say, oh my God, yes? Or did he say, oh my God, yes? Right? He really stressed it, meaning, yeah, very much. I experienced huge culture shock, in other words. So he says, oh my God, yes. When you first get off the plane, there's quite a bit to deal with. Now, this means that there are a lot of confusions or miscommunications, perhaps, a lot of problems or a lot of difficulty to cope with, to handle, to deal with. And he says, and Korea is very different, okay, from where I come from. And then he gives examples talking about the busyness of a city. We all know where he's from, right? He's from Minnesota, and I guess Minnesota is not a very busy city. So he says it's very different because of the busyness of the city and the neon lights everywhere. That's true. Neon. Neon is the proper pronunciation, but he's saying there are lights everywhere and everything or everybody is so busy, and that's quite different from where I come from. So he did experience a rather big culture shock. And he gives us details. He says it was a bit difficult in the beginning. In the beginning, okay? Not at the beginning. We say in the beginning, okay? In the very beginning. And actually, you experience this huge wave of culture shock. Now, when you talk about Hallyu, for example, we say the Korean wave, right? So you can say a huge wave of something, meaning a big amount of something, a large amount of something, a great amount of something. So he's saying a huge culture shock or huge wave of culture shock. And he says to the point at which or where it kind of gets difficult. And he said that happened kind of every 3 months. So what is he saying? He's talking about experiencing huge waves of culture shock, right? And it didn't just, I guess, affect him just once. When he first came to Korea, he said every 3 months he would feel or experience huge waves of culture shock. So it was not easy. And he says there was a rhythm to it. I guess it was kind of repetitive. There was a repetition to it. And a lot of other foreigners I've had this conversation with felt the same thing. What does that mean? They felt the same thing, meaning they agreed with me. They also felt huge waves of culture shock. So they felt, okay, the same thing, the same experience. It's like the honeymoon period, okay? So we're talking about honeymoon period. So when couples get married, what is a honeymoon period, right? Right? Just in the beginning of something, you're starting something out. So when you say honeymoon period or honeymoon phase, you're talking about the very first stages of something, okay? So the first 3 months, it's really great. Why? Because you're in a new country. So everything is new and exciting, right? And of course, Peter says it's new and exciting. But after traveling elsewhere in Southeast Asia, he says nothing is shocking anymore. Now, so what does he say? He says, after traveling elsewhere to other places in Southeast Asia, nothing is shocking anymore. He's saying, I've been shocked so many times due to many, many things. Nothing really shocks me anymore, okay? Nothing surprises me anymore. Okay, it's pretty natural. Now, Rachel asks, why is that? What did you see there? And he says, well, you've seen abject poverty, okay? So when you say poverty, of course, we're talking about people that are less fortunate. Perhaps people that don't have homes, they're not well off, they don't have enough food or money. So very, very poor people or less fortunate people. But you're talking about just huge or really a hopelessness. So hopeless poverty and people living in horrible situations, terrible situations. And then he says it changes the way you think about, okay, the world in general. So I think it's true. Often if we just see the good things in life, we just figure that the world or life is full of only good things. But when you really experience the sad things and the bad things in life happening in other parts of the country, you come to realize, wow, I'm really happy. I'm really fortunate. There are less fortunate people. So he's saying it changes the way you think about the world in general. It changes your perspective, in other words. So here we go. She says it's very overwhelming, meaning overpowering. And those emotions, those feelings, you can't really describe in words. This is something that I do want to tell you in Korean. Describe in words. 말로 표현하다. Exactly. So when something is very difficult to just explain to someone in words, you can say, well, it's really difficult to describe in words. Rachel said you can't really describe in words. So Peter says, have you had a bit of culture shock? Now, Rachel said, I have. She's talking about her experience. I spent a couple months in Senegal, West Africa, and things were different. Of course, we're talking about different settings, different environments. And she says, we were eating with our hands, okay, rather than utensils. Utensils meaning things like spoons and forks and chopsticks, perhaps. They're all eating utensils. And she says, but that's their culture. That's their culture. I experienced a lot of culture shock when I went back to the States. So she's talking about perhaps not just one experience, but several, exactly two. First of all, when she went to West Africa, things were very different. So that is when she experienced or had culture shock, but also when she returned to America. And then they both said, reverse culture shock. That's right. Reverse means what? the other way. If we put our gear in reverse when we drive, we go backwards, right? So this is a kind of culture shock that you feel when you return back home or return to the place that you started off, okay? All right, well, that brings us to an end to today's actual talk, everyone. I hope this helps. So listen to it one more time and check out how much more you can understand.
So Peter, you've been in Korea for a good several years now, right?
Quite a long time.
You're probably adapted to Korean life pretty well.
I think I've learned to, navigate the playing field a bit.
Yeah. Did you ever experience culture shock when you
Oh
first
my
came
God,
here?
yes.
Oh yeah.
Well, when you first get off the plane, there's quite a bit to deal with,
Right.
and Korea is very different from where I come from. Between the the busyness of the city and the
Right.
neon lights everywhere,
That's
and
true.
the way people deal with each other, it was a bit difficult in the beginning. And actually, you experience this huge kind of wave of culture shock about at 3 months,
Oh,
as I recall.
that's the point where you kind of realize you're in a different country, a different culture, maybe.
Well, or it kind of gets difficult.
Okay.
And that happens kind of every 3 months. There was a rhythm to it. And a lot of other foreigners had this conversation with.
Yeah, it's like the honeymoon
felt same
period,
thing.
right? So like the first 3 months, it's really great because you're in
It's
a new
new and
country,
exciting.
and then by 3 months you kind of
Like,
realize.
I know it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I see. That's interesting.
But after traveling elsewhere in Southeast Asia, nothing's shocking anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is that? What did you see there?
Well, when you've seen abject poverty, and people really living in horrible situations,
Right.
yeah,
It can
it
be
changes
very-
the way you think about the world. in
Yeah,
general.
definitely. It's very overwhelming, and those emotions you feel, you can't really describe into words because they're so new. You know.
So
Exactly.
have you had a bit of culture shock?
I have. I spent a couple months in Senegal, West Africa, and I definitely had a few culture shocks there. Things were different. We were eating with our hands rather than utensils, and that's just their culture. So that was different. But I experienced a lot of culture shock when I went back to the States.
Reverse culture
shock,
shock,
exactly.
yeah.
But I'll tell you that some other time.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, hope you enjoyed the actual talk one last time. Now let's move on to actual talk expressions. Expressions, phrases, and vocabulary you can make use of when talking about today's topic, which is, once again, culture shock. So as I did mention, when do people experience or have culture shock? Not only when they travel to other countries, but also when you move schools, when you move from one place to another, move into a different home perhaps, or even move to a new job. So let's talk about that. What about this one? What I witnessed in that country, so perhaps you've traveled, you're talking about your travel experiences. Now, what I witnessed in that country, what I saw in that country was completely beyond me. Now, here is an expression you can really make use of. Beyond me. What is beyond? Far away, right? You can say beyond those mountains, far away, behind those mountains, right? So if you say something is beyond you, it's beyond me, it means that you really have a difficult time understanding it. It surpasses your understanding. So you're totally confused about something, okay? So if you really have a hard time understanding something, you're in total shock and confusion, you can say something is beyond me. So if you witness something very surprising, something very unusual, you can say what I witnessed in that country was completely beyond me. Okay, let's move on. I felt out of place the entire time I was there. Entire time means the whole time, but let's take a look at the beginning. I felt out of place. What does that mean? I felt out of place. It means that you didn't feel like you actually were supposed to be there. You felt awkward, okay? You felt that you weren't welcome, for example. Feel out of place. Feel very, very awkward because you think, maybe this is not the place for me. Okay, moving on. There were psychological. This has to do with the way you think. Also, social, how you associate with people. Cultural challenges involved in adjusting. So you're talking about problems you had. So there were psychological challenges involved in adjusting or adapting, okay? Or social or cultural. The challenges here, we're talking about difficulties, okay? Things that you had to challenge. Moving on, also ways to talk about culture shock. I've been here about 2 months now. So say, for example, you moved, you got a new job, okay? So you can say, I've been here about 2 months now, and I still find a new area, a new room, or multiple new people every other day. Have you ever felt this? If you have moved from one place to another, a workplace, and you still feel awkward after 2 months, you can say this, okay? Everything is still new to you. Now, one of my first few weeks at EBS, were a blur of getting lost. A blur is what? We talked about blurry, right? Something is a blur when we were talking about vision the other day. So a blur is something that is not very clear. It's blurry, it's fuzzy. So my first few weeks at EBS were a blur of getting lost. Basically means you got lost every other day. Okay, moving on. My first few days were nothing but. Okay, were nothing but, meaning what? It was full of what you were going to say. Trying to memorize so many new faces. In other words, you can say, my first few days were all about trying to memorize so many new faces, or new names, for example. Let's move on. During my first few weeks at my new job, at my new school, I felt like I didn't fit in. Okay, remember we did take a look at the expression, I felt out of place. This is a very similar expression as well. I didn't fit in. It didn't feel right. I felt awkward there, okay? All right, moving on to some common symptoms of culture shock. Let's quickly go over them. You're talking about the symptoms, how you felt, perhaps. I felt extremely homesick. You miss home. You want to go back home. I felt extremely resentful. Resentful. You're full of something. You're full of hatred, okay? You hate everything. You hate everyone. There's so much hate in you. So I felt extremely resentful. You're blaming people. You hated the situation. Also, tired, anxious, isolated, left out, and also depressed. Isolated is what? Okay, you felt like you were alone, okay? Left out also is a feeling that describes feeling aloneness, okay? And also depressed, as you all know, means to be very sad. So you felt these feelings or emotions. I felt resentful towards something, towards somebody, or in this case, the new environment. You hated the new environment. Moving on, I felt reluctant to, okay? You are unwilling to, you don't want to. I felt reluctant to associate with people. Associate, okay? If you say something associate, it is usually used as a noun, but here it is a verb, associate. Associate with people, meaning you didn't feel like talking to people, communicating with them, bonding with them, becoming friends with people, in other words. Okay, now also common reactions to culture shock, what could they be? I often became, tired and withdrawn. Tired, we all know. Withdrawn is a feeling of, I guess, being exhausted, but also just not interested in anything. You don't feel like doing anything. You feel far away. It's like you distance yourself from others, okay? And other reactions, I became psychologically Exactly. Remember, psychological challenges? Psychological meaning, that's right. It has to do with our thinking, okay? Our thought. Mental. So I became psychologically drained. What is drained? We did take a look at this a long, long time ago. If you say, I feel drained, it means that you feel like your energy has been sucked out. You feel very exhausted. You don't feel like doing anything, okay? You don't have the energy or the interest to do anything, but you're psychologically 정신적으로 지친 거죠, okay? Also, I got frustrated, agitated, irritated, easily, very easily, and had a hard time venting my anger. Vent, here, as you see, to vent means to give off, okay? To give off. So if you say vent my anger, it means release my anger. So I got frustrated easily, thus I was very sensitive, and had a hard time venting my anger, blowing away my anger, okay? Releasing my anger. So these are some common reactions to culture shock that people often talk about. Now, it is your job to practice these expressions and phrases, and perhaps, if you ever get a chance to talk about culture shock, make use of them. Okay, everyone, job well done. Let's now move on. Okay, everyone, it is time for today's idiom attack. Are you ready for it? Now, take a breather, take a deep breath, relax. We did go over a lot so far. So think of this as a quick break, a relaxing break. Here is today's idiom. It is a culture vulture. Now, keep in mind that the idioms that I do bring every lesson does not necessarily relate to the topic. However, they often do have words related to the topic. So we've got the word culture. Now, here is perhaps a tip as to what this may mean. A vulture is a person or thing that prays. So simply put, a very greedy something. So what is a culture vulture? Here is an example sentence. My wife is such a culture vulture. She dragged me to every museum in the city on our honeymoon. I would hate that. Yeah. But anyhow, she is a culture vulture. Okay, definition, let's check it out. In Korean, 문화광, 음악, 미술, 문학 등에 지대한 관심이 있는 사람, 지나친 관심이 있는 사람이죠. Okay, in English it is someone who is extremely interested in the arts. So someone who's very, very keen to see and experience art, such as theater and art and literature, even music perhaps, okay? So another sample sentence. For culture vultures, there's no place like Vienna. For culture vultures, there's no place like Vienna, meaning Vienna is the perfect place for culture vultures. Okay, now you know what culture vulture means. Make use of it in the future. Let's take you to our next segment.
Talk about your culture shock experience in the past. Where were you, and what were some specific incidences? How did you first react, and how do you feel about them now? Discuss them in detail.
Last year, I went to India as a voluntary worker, and I met a lot of Indians there, from kids to middle-aged, and they expressed agreement as ducking their head aside, and it looks like they are not sure of what I'm saying, and looks really ambiguous. So I was so confused about their gestures, so I explained over and over again. But finally, I realized that they're agreeing with me, so I can communicate with them very much. So I'm really glad that I can understand the difference between cultural differences between India and Korea.
That was a wonderful interview. Thank you so much. 정형아님 고맙습니다. So she talked about her experience of going to India to volunteer, and she did mention that she did experience some differences in culture, right? So let's check out what a wonderful job she did. There were some great points and of course some oopsies as well. The first good point, the first great thing she said was, last year I went to India as a voluntary worker, or you can say volunteer worker, and I met a lot of Indians there. So she began by talking about her experience. She talked about when and where she traveled to, why, and what happened there. There's so much information in just one sentence, so wonderfully done. Another one, she said, I was so confused about, okay? You can be confused about something. Their gestures. That's right. I think often in Korea we say body language, right? But instead of body language, try using the word gesture, okay? Gesture, just the movement of the body. You can use hand gestures, okay? For example, move your hands to express your feelings, thoughts, whatever. So she said, I was very confused about, or so confused about their gestures. Let's check out a few mistakes here and there. She said, they express agreement as ducking their heads aside, and it looks like they are not sure of what I'm saying. So this is a rather long sentence, but I did keep it. Let's take a look. They express, we're talking about gesture, right? She was confused about gesture. They express agreement as ducking. So duck here is not quack, quack, duck. Basically, duck, D-U-C-K, means to do this, okay? So it is an action used as a verb. Their head, okay? But duck usually means, folding, or looking downwards and upwards, again, not sideways. But she said their heads aside, maybe side to side, and it looks like they are not sure of what I'm saying, okay? Let's move on and see how you can correct this. They expressed, see, we're talking about your past experience, her past experience of last year. They expressed agreement by tilting their head side to side, okay? So tilt is what? You can tilt sideways, forward, or backwards. So tilt, kind of move, side to side, not side by side, side to side. So perhaps, something like that. And it looked like, past once again, they were not sure of what I was saying. So tense is very, very important. So basically a few corrections here and there and perfect. Okay, let's move on to one more oopsie. So she says, so I'm really glad that I can understand the big culture differences between India and Korea. Now, yep, very well done. Between A and B. Differences between A and B, that's wonderfully done. But it's, these parts here, let's check out what you can do. I'm really glad that I learned, once again, or that I can now understand. I learned the big cultural differences, that's right, between India and Korea. So just a small, tiny correction made there. I'm really glad that I learned the cultural differences between A and B. So I hope that you don't make the same mistakes in the future when you happen to do an interview in English about culture shock or any other topic. Job well done. So how is today's lesson? I do understand that sometimes many of the topics or lessons could be a bit difficult because there's so much information to pack in your head and remember them. But always remember just to have fun with English. There's no need to memorize everything. You don't have to do anything. Just try to watch the lessons, listen to what I say, and have fun during the 40 minutes with me. Anyhow, today we talked about culture shock, and I hope that you learned a lot. I have added some extra information on our homepage, so feel free to come by, okay? Next time I'll be joining you, and we'll be talking about Korean traditions. The traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation from a long, long time ago in Korea, and perhaps we can maybe touch upon Korean customs as well. So please do join for that. In the meantime, come to our homepage at www.ebse.co.kr and search for Jennifer Actual Speaking. One more time, a reminder, check out our homepage and make use of all the information that I leave up there, okay? Okay, thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next time. Bye, everyone.